Hi everyone, and welcome to this check-in with Dave Cross, the instructor of the Creative Love course, 30 Days of Photoshop, and one of the most active students that we had, Betty Brooks. We're going to go over and recap some images that she's worked on, and after that we're going to have a Q&A. We have a few questions, and if you have any, please put them into the chat screen here, and we'll get to as many as we can. Okay, Dave, if you want to get started or talk about your upcoming course, you're free to do that.
You want to do that first a little bit?
It's up to you.
Well, let's actually jump in and talk about the 30 Days of Photoshop and some of the images that Betty sent in. One of the things that I've enjoyed the most about this 30-day class is that we kind of built into it some sort of assignments that people had the option of doing, and some people did quite a bit. And it's really interesting because normally in a typical situation, it's a one-way street. You teach a technique and then hope that people are using it. So to see evidence of people at least making an attempt to try things or put some of the lessons into action was really nice. We had that Google Plus community going on where people could post their images. So that was pretty cool. So well done to everyone that took that challenge on to try and do some of the assignments, because it's not always easy to find that time. But I've always felt that's the way you're going to really reinforce something you're learning, is not just sitting and watching, but becoming actively involved. And that's also why in any class that I teach, I try not to just make it like a recipe where it says follow these 5 or 10 steps and you get this result. It's more about here's why a layer mask is useful, and here's why a particular technique, why to use an adjustment layer versus something else, for example, is the way to go. So I'm going to put Betty on the spot a little bit here and say, when you were undertaking a couple of the projects, like one of the ones that we're going to look at is the one that has the little girl kind of in the forest.
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk just for a second about when you started that project, what you found was the most challenging part of it.
Well, aside from
you do that, I'll show people the image that we're talking about.
Okay, cutting her out, but then when you get her in the forest, the lighting, and I'm really struggling with getting things so that they look right.
Making things match.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've been working this afternoon even on something else.
Okay, well let's take. I'm going to share my screen so I can show you what we're talking about here.
By the way, that's my granddaughter.
Very nice. So right away, there's a couple things about this that caught my eye. First of all, needless to say, there's nothing that makes me happier than when I open someone else's document and I see layers, because seeing a JPEG doesn't really say anything in terms of how it was done. And so when I look at layers and see, like in this case, you've used a layer mask to cut her out, which is excellent, because as we talked about in various times throughout the lessons in 30 Days of Photoshop, anytime you erase or delete, you're kind of making a permanent change. So the fact that she is cut out, but you still have this layer mask, if necessary, to tweak the results, that's really great. You've done that, and then you've got 2 adjustment layers sitting on top of that, and then to add to the realism, you added this layer on top. So there, right now it looks like she's kind of just floating in space, but here adding that little bit of grass just adds to the believability, in the sense that it looks like she's behind something. It's always difficult to blend a real person into a background that doesn't look quite. I mean, this is obviously a backdrop that someone created at some point. It's not a real photograph, so it's right away. The good part about that is you don't have to worry quite so much about making it look incredibly believable, because it is. Everyone's going to look at it and say, well, this is not a real situation, but you're still trying to make the tones match as much as you can. The one thing I did notice when you get closer to here is there's a lot of noise going on in this image. So the original, what was the original source of the
I took the
photo?
picture and I had her against a sheet. Unfortunately, she was on a couch, so not all the parts of her feet and legs showed.
Right.
But that one is a lesser quality. I found out that after I'd done a bunch of the work, and I have a better one. I think I put it up with just a cutout.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, she hates that picture.
Sure. That's one of the things that makes something when you're talking about trying to match things together. Zoomed out, it looks pretty good, but when you get to the actual size, you can see how everything in the background photo is so clean and smooth, and she's fairly noisy, which normally noise comes from taking a photo that doesn't have enough light, or the camera settings are such that it has to add noise through ISO, or it's a smartphone photo or something like that. So one thing that we could potentially do is try to remove some of this noise to make it look a little more realistic. And as I hype in all of my classes, rather than just doing this directly to this layer and not being able to change it, I would convert to a smart filter, which is going to make it look like the layer mask is gone, but it's now just embedded inside that smart object. But now I could use various options for removing noise. I'm using Photoshop CC, so I would actually use the Camera Raw filter, because Camera Raw has a better noise reduction capability than Photoshop does. So going in here, we can see in a second there, you can see that I can start to reduce some of the noise, and right away it's already, it's going to be not going to be able to take it away completely without losing some bit of quality, but at least you see the difference. It probably should be, if I turn that off, can you see the difference?
Oh yeah, I tried to do it just with the noise filter.
And that's why
probably not in that one not in that one file, but somewhere else.
The difference is the reduced noise filter in Photoshop is decent, but Camera Raw is much better. So one of the other recurring themes that a lot of people find is that Camera Raw and or Lightroom, depending on which one you start with, you want to do as much work as you can there, because there are many things that are either easier and or in this case better than Photoshop. And one of the things that I recommend is creating a two-way street between either Camera Raw in Photoshop or Lightroom in Photoshop, so you have the option of continually editing your images, so that you're not kind of saying, oh well, that's the best I can do. Now, the one thing that happens here is, for example, now that I'm zooming a little closer, I can see there's a couple of areas like around her hair that are kind of missing a little bit, and because I converted this layer into a smart object, it looks like I can no longer edit the layer mask. So I have to double click, and here's my document where I'm just seeing just the contents. You'll notice that it looks noisy again because that filter was applied after the fact. So you can see if I'm just holding down the Shift key to turn the mask on and off, you can see where there are some areas that didn't work quite as well. Now the good news is, and this is one of the things, that extracting someone off of a background can be difficult, but the good part is you can often give yourself more than one opportunity. So for example here, now Betty, what did, when you made this original cutout, what tool did you use to?
I used the quick selection tool, and then when things weren't going right, I started playing around with other parts. And actually, at some point, I can't remember exactly on this one file, but I have taken the mask and painted around on the edges to help sometimes.
Sure.
But I use refine, whatever you call it.
Refine edge.
Thank you. Refine edge. And I end up with like a halo, and I actually, with her hair, had that problem. And so I wanted to sharpen it, and I think I went in and painted on the mask.
Okay, so just to show you, here's, and this will help people that run into this problem. I'm just going to start as if we're starting from square one here. One of the challenges with Refine Edge is, and this is contrary to what Adobe would have us believe, I have found that it's very difficult to get a nice edge on both the hard edges, like in this case her legs and her arms, and soft edges like hair. So the way that I approach it is I try and do it in two pieces. So I'm going to duplicate this layer so I have two parts to work with. So first of all, with the quick selection tool, and I'll just tell you up front, I didn't try this ahead of time, so this is me doing this on the fly. And all I'm trying to do is get fairly accurate at this point, but I'm going to ignore her hair. I'm not going to worry about that at all. For right now, I'm just trying to get this part here looking relatively good. And one of the challenges becomes that when there's not a big contrast between the person or the subject and the background, there are some parts where it's kind of hard to tell, is that a shadow or is that part of her? If I click Refine Edge, now without changing any settings, the edge will look pretty good, because we don't want it to be so perfectly sharp that in the other photograph it will look odd. So we'll make this one into a layer mask, and then I do the same thing, but this time I'm going to try and make her hair look as good as I can and not worry about the body. And this is an approach that I take all the time, because I just found that, like I said, it's very rare I have found that I can find a setting in Refine Edge that does a great job for both. So now in this case I can turn on this Smart Radius and start to move the settings up. We are going to have a few problems because this photo is so noisy. That's why you're going to get that kind of halo look like that. So it might be a bit of a challenge just because of the noise. But let's just see what we can get here. So now I've got two layers, each with a layer mask, and now the hair is looking okay, so I'll use a bit of help, and the edge of her is looking pretty good. If we look at the layer mask, and I do that by holding down Option or Alt and clicking on it, I can see that's that little issue we're talking about with the hair. So if I take my paintbrush, and we talk about this at some length in the 30-day class, one of the best things ever invented when you're trying to fine-tune things is this overlay mode, because what this allows me to do is I
forgot about it.
kind of go in, and this allows me to just make subtle changes without, if I didn't have that turned on, I'd be getting big white or black strokes everywhere, but here I can kind of go in and do a bit of fine-tuning. So that right away it's going to look a little better. And then if I close and save this, what it should do is now update and put her back in our composition. You can see now the hair and her body looks a little better. It still needs a bit of help, and now you'll see also notice that the camera raw filter is reapplied. So even though when I was working on her separately with the quick selection tool, it looked kind of noisy, now we're seeing her in the context of with that the camera raw sharp noise reduction filter turned on. What's kind of interesting about this too is that when I look at it, it's okay, but I still feel like I'm seeing a bit of a line around her. Because she's a separate layer here, I could almost take another run at it. I just Command or Control click on the layer to load it as selection, and then hit Refine Edge again, and I can even do very subtle little changes like shift the edge a little bit and maybe just do a little tiny bit of this. So now I have two levels of layer masking. I have the layer mask within the smart object, and then this layer mask that's been added. Now this is taking it up a little step, but this is once you start to kind of get a feeling for working with layers and smart objects, this is how you can give yourself multiple runs at something, to try and give yourself more options. So here's the other one you said you had. and it's still noisy. And I think part of I see you've got sharper.
Well, maybe that's not the one then. I may not have put it up.
Okay, may not be, but
I kind of discovered that after the fact.
Right. Now, part of that is, I mean, one of the things that the realities of Photoshop is that, you know, Photoshop is a great tool, but at the same time, can only do so much. So that if you were to do that project again, then I would make sure, like, find some kind of light source, whether it's even just a window or something, because as soon as your camera has to work that hard to make someone look bright enough, generally it gets quite noisy, and that's one of the hardest things to improve upon without it being noticeable. And so while you can fix certain things in Photoshop, a very noisy photo like that one is one of the more challenging ones to work with. But overall, when I looked at it, I say that's a pretty good job, because it was a challenging photo to try to make fit in there, and I think you were definitely on the right track. Putting adjustment layers, you had the adjustment layer clipped to just your subject, so that way you could tweak the color toning a little bit to make it kind of match in with the background that was behind her. So yeah, you were definitely on the right track. And like I said, it made me very happy to see lots of layers and meaning lots of options for you to change your mind and try different things. So good job. So this other one that one of the other ones you had, another layer document. And by the way, another thing that I noticed, which was good, it always worries me when people send me a file and it's physically small, meaning they probably were creating it to put on like a website or something. Let me go back and share my screen again, sorry. I'm talking about it, but I'm not showing you, so let's actually show you now. Go, see it now?
Yep.
Yeah, so here's a good example. I mean, although it takes up more memory to do so, I always suggest making your image bigger than you think you'll need, because you can always scale it down anytime, because the worst thing can happen to me is that you create something you really like, and then someone says, oh, I love that, can you make it a poster? And the answer is, well, no, not really, because of the size I started with. So the fact that you started as a fairly large file, that's good, because that means you've got some room to work with. You can print it fairly big, but can also reduce it down in size. So in this case, again, this made me very happy to see smart filters and a mask and a separate retouching layer, which is excellent. And then you made a group with some of these grungy layers in it to do kind of like a texture overlay thing. So this one is really good. I really like the way it's all come together. And but again, it's one of those examples where I think this is what I prefer to see, is when I open this document, I can tell what you did, and you know, for the most part, obviously there may be some steps along the way where you tried something, but when I see smart filters, I can look at them and say, oh, this one has this filter applied or that filter applied. Now, some of them, like, I don't have Topaz on my machine, so that one's grayed out, but it still tells me that you did it, and that's one of the advantages of saving as a PSD file, is that, and this is one of the things I'm going to be talking about at some length in my next class, that talks about working non-destructively as an everyday kind of habit, and this is one of the reasons, is because this could have been a project you had done 8 months ago, but you can still look back at it and go, oh yeah, I did a smart filter and I made a mask, so you can kind of reverse engineer and figure out how you did it, but then equally importantly, tweak it or use the same look but with a different photograph. And I think that's really important, so that's why I always recommend that you have the PSD version of your file as your master working copy, and whatever you need at the end, whether it's a JPEG or a TIFF or something of that nature. Okay. Now, was there anything with this project in particular that
that one I was
with, or?
pretty happy with how that one came out.
Yeah, and in fact,
bigger too.
what's that?
I said she smiled bigger too.
But just to point out a couple of other things that is really good, even the very background layer here, it would have been easy to just take a layer and fill it with a color. But then if you want to experiment, try something else, here's an example where this type of adjustment layer is easier, because if I go to that layer, now kind of live on the fly, I can try any color I want and I can see what I'm going to get. If I had just used if this was just a regular background layer where you said fill with this color, it would have been an extra step every time. So anytime you can use adjustment layers, it means you open up this possibility as well of this kind of ongoing experimentation.
Yeah, I was copying the color on her sweater.
Right, sure. Yep, well, that makes sense. And like I said, putting the retouching on a separate layer, I think, is always a good idea because, well, for a couple reasons. One is if you realize after the fact that when you look at it more closely you don't like it, or you missed a bit, or maybe it was a little too intense, then you can lower the opacity of the layer a little bit if you need to, or anything of that nature. So for this particular project, I think this was part of the reason I pulled this one out of the ones I looked at, is because I think it particularly demonstrates well a number of things, using adjustment layers, using masks, using smart filters, and also in this case a group. So you've got a whole bunch of variations of bits and pieces. You could have left those out, not in a group, but then it just makes your layers panel more cluttered. So this makes sense in a case like this to say all of these things are part of the same look, so why not put them in a group, and then you have the option in one click of either turning them on or off, or changing the blend mode, or whatever it might be. So again, I think this was a really good example of exactly the kind of document that we should be creating. And when I first started using these techniques, I was fanatical about naming all my layers, like retouching and everything else, and after a while I didn't do that quite as much. I think that's a really good habit for people who are just starting out, so that later on you can look at a layer and remind yourself what it's for. But it's certainly not a requirement, but it can certainly help a whole lot. Right? So, Betty, did you have any other questions about the things that we, anything that you particularly struggled with?
I've seen in more than one class how people take the shadow and make it on a separate layer, and could I find how to do that? No. Finally did this afternoon, but I mean, I've been sure. I thought there was a checkbox on the FX stuff, but no.
Well, and that's one that's one of those examples where it is possible, but you would never typically find it, because even the name for the command isn't what you'd expect. Because once you've made the drop shadow layer style, you would think it would be a command called separate shadow or something, but it, in fact, I have to go and look at it to remind myself what it's even called, because it's some other name. Hold on a second, I'll just do this as we're talking.
Yeah, I spent a long time trying to figure it out. And I don't even remember what I found out this afternoon at this point.
Let's see. Okay, I'm trying to think where I have that option here. Hold on a second.
Was it under layer with?
Well, it's the
Separate layers or something like that, isn't it?
Well, but that's the thing. The name is even a little more unusual. It's not just as easy as that. Where is it? Oh, it just says create layer, and somehow you're supposed to know that means create a layer from my whatever that layer style is. In case of drop shadow, then there'll be a separate layer underneath that is the drop shadow. So it's one of those things where the function is there, but the name of it isn't terribly helpful. So.
No kidding.
Yeah. And that's unfortunately one of the realities that happens to people with Photoshop, is that the people that make Photoshop are engineers, and to them it makes perfect sense, but to the rest of us it's like, why would you think that a command called that would be of any help or the solution to what you're looking for? Unfortunately, that happens quite often.
Well, I decided that it was kind of important to separate them out because I was having trouble with shadows too.
Mm-hmm. The
Sometimes.
main, and this is one of those situations where I always joke about the fact when people ask a Photoshop question to say 99% of the time the answer is it depends. And that's a good example. If someone said to me, should I separate the shadow, I would answer, well, that depends. Do you need to tweak the shadow in some way, like bend it or transform it? Then yes. Otherwise, it's a good idea to keep the shadow part of the layer, just because if you alter the layer, the shadow will automatically alter. But at a certain point, if you're not getting the result you want, that's when you say, okay, I guess now that I've got to this point, if I separate the shadow, then I can start to bend it a bit or do something that I couldn't otherwise do. But it's one of those things where it really does depend on the situation.
Well, thanks.
Sure. All right. Was there anything else we want to talk about with the 30 days?
Oh, I got to mention, it was a good thing I bought the class because I wasn't there, so to speak.
Right. Now, just out of curiosity, did you do like one a day, or did you sometimes do 2 or 3 lessons? How did you?
Well, we went on a trip, so I missed a whole bunch. So I did a whole bunch in one day, and then the next 2 or 3 days I did a whole bunch more.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is, you hear a lot of stuff, and I've done quite a few classes, so that I sort of know that I know, but don't remember everything. And
right.
It puts it together a little bit more for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I still obviously know I don't remember things.
Well, and that takes some time, and that's part of the point of doing little mini projects like the ones that you sent us, was then you're putting into action and trying to do those things and remember some of the techniques. And my hope is that most people can at least remember things like, I probably should use a layer mask at this point, and then it's just a matter of putting that into action. There's always going to be commands or something you don't use very often that are harder to remember, but the key functions like selecting and masking don't really change that much from one situation to another, just maybe more difficult or take longer, but there's sort of this core of concepts that are fairly typical on a day-to-day basis, and then there's other things that we build on top of that.
Speaking of that, you reminded me about separating the person into 2 parts, for the hard, the straight lines, or whatever you want to call them, sharp lines, and the soft. I forgot about that until you said it. And
yeah,
I
that's one of those things
you showed it.
It's funny how I always talk about that generally we are creatures of habit, and we do things a certain way because it's just the way we remember. And I still remember the day that it suddenly occurred to me I should try separating this person into 2 pieces, and I was like, holy smokes, that just saved me so much time that now it's kind of my default reaction. As if a person has hair, then that's what I do. If I'm extracting myself, I don't bother because I don't worry about that anymore. But anyone that actually has hair, especially if that hair is like blowing in the wind or anything, then right away I would say, don't even try to do it in one shot. It's not going to happen. And you may remember one of my favorite phrases is to say end up with. So I want to say I want to end up with this person extracted, even if it means they're in 3 pieces. To the viewer, when they see the final product, they don't know that you took 3 pieces to make that person extracted. But that makes life easier for your Photoshop and therefore you, then to me that's the way to go.
Need a little checklist so I remember these things.
Yeah, it's always hard. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to unmute and jump in a little bit. We have a couple of questions from our attempt to do this on May 12th, so I'm going to go through those now, if you think it's a good time.
Sure.
Okay. The first is from Jay Chatskill. And then he says, Dave, in the course you talk about using Camera Raw, but not Lightroom. Please advise me in work circumstances to use each. I have been using Lightroom for a number of years and do not know the compelling reasons for using Camera Raw. I look forward to learning what you think about this. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I personally use Camera Raw more than Lightroom. And for those people that aren't completely familiar, at their core, Lightroom and Camera Raw both have exactly the same engine when it comes to the commands to adjust an image. So from that respect, when you're adjusting a photo with exposure and everything else, really there's no difference. The difference is Lightroom, you can do other things as well, all in one program. But my style of using photography is a lot of the time I take photos with the intention of using them in Photoshop to create artwork of some kind. So therefore, I go in expecting to work in Photoshop, and Camera Raw has a more direct link between Photoshop and Camera Raw than Lightroom does. So let me just see here. Share my screen. Oops. Apparently it's not voice activated. You have to actually click a button, not just say share my screen. And okay. Let's see. I thought I had something right here, but I can't find it. Okay. Hold on one second. I didn't plan for this very carefully, so it'll take me just a second to find the thing I want to show you. That's not it. Okay, here we go. So this very confusing looking diagram, let me work through this to explain how this works. So if I was, I'll just ignore this for a minute. If I was in Camera Raw, one of the options is I can just click on a checkbox and make a direct link between Photoshop and Camera Raw that goes back and forth, and I'll show you that in a second. Here's why, while you can do it in Lightroom, it just takes an extra step, but it is possible. So to more directly answer his question, use whichever tool you're comfortable with. If people are very comfortable using Lightroom and occasionally want to jump into Photoshop, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and there's no difference. Here's the only difference from my perspective is when it comes time to being able to create this editing path that goes back and forth. Most people that I've met when they're using Lightroom, they use a command called edit in Photoshop, which is fine, except when you do that, it's a one-way street. In other words, it takes whatever you've done in Lightroom, brings it in Photoshop, the end. In other words, you can't go back to Lightroom and say, but wait, I want to adjust the exposure. So instead, if you use this command called open as smart object in Photoshop, what it does is it takes whatever you've done in Lightroom and it opens it in Photoshop. And it opens it as this thing called a smart object. Then, if you decide, now that I've done that, I want to tweak some of the settings, if you double-click on the smart object, it doesn't go back to Lightroom, it goes to Camera Raw. Now, for anyone who's never used Camera Raw before, there'll be a momentary feeling of what's going on here until you realize that the controls, all the sliders, are exactly the same in Camera Raw and Lightroom, so there's absolutely no difference. So you adjust the settings in Camera Raw, and then when you save it, it goes back to Photoshop for you to continue working. Eventually, when you're all done, you close and save the document, and then it goes back to your Lightroom catalog. And what will happen is you'll have your original Lightroom file, and then right beside it will be another file called blah 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 -edit.psd. So this way it still becomes part of the Lightroom way of working, but it's done with this little roundabout. It's not quite as direct. Okay, so that's one of the main reasons why, because I don't use Lightroom as my everyday tool, it's just easier for me to start in Camera Raw because it's more direct. Ultimately, you can get to the same effect using Camera Raw. So here's how, for example, I would do it. Is here's a I'll just use this one. Here's a Camera Raw file So if I open it, what I have done previously is in the workflow options, which is this kind of hyperlink looking thing at the bottom, I have open in Photoshop as smart objects selected. And that means if I make an adjustment and I hit open object, it's going to open it in Photoshop, but over here, I don't know if you can see that zooming in or not, but there, this little symbol means I've created this thing called a smart object, which means no matter what I do in Photoshop, I can start to make my Photoshop style adjustments to it, but then realize I don't like the settings. I double click on it, it goes right back to Camera Raw where I can adjust it, click OK, and then it updates. So this is where, for me, Camera Raw and Photoshop is much more direct. If you're starting with Lightroom, it can be done, but it just takes that extra kind of step. So there's really no right or wrong. I mean, the people who use Lightroom as their main tool, that's great. And if you want to use it in Photoshop, my main recommendation would be don't just say edit in Photoshop, but choose the open as a smart object in Photoshop.
Okay, yeah, that's a great and very detailed answer. And I've got another question that came in, and this one is from Stephen Rowe. And he says, Dave, have been a long-time follower. Do you have any tips on making an extraction of subjects from a busy background and with different luminescence levels? Also, do you have any plans for a book in the future? Many thanks for sharing.
Sure. Well, I'll address the book thing first. To me, the days of books, unless you're one of a handful of authors that still are getting published in traditional books, those days are diminishing drastically for many of us. So I actually just brought out a series of 3 ebooks for 2 reasons. It's a lot easier and can be updated constantly, and it means I can focus on a particular topic. So I have 3 ebooks with Peach Pit Press, which are all about Photoshop productivity in different sessions. So whether I'll ever have a physical printed book or not, I don't know if that will happen again.
And just really quick, let me cut in. For those ebooks that you just mentioned, for people who maybe aren't watching this live, but they're watching it, a few days later, they go to Peach Pit Press or to your website or to both, or how do they find them?
Yeah, either one. I mean, peachpitpress.com is the website, and they have a section called Fuel Books, which is their name for their ebooks, or you can even just go on peachpit.com and in the search box just type my name and you'll see my ebooks and some ancient books that I wrote many, many, many years ago that are still on there apparently. Or you can go to my website, dcross.com, either one. Now, the other part of the question was extracting where there are some challenges, and this actually kind of ties into what we were just talking about, because let's just close some of these other things. So here's an example of a photo I took in my studio that I specifically wanted to extract him and put him on a different background. Now, out of the camera, I deliberately wanted this very dark look, but the challenge that I now face is his hair is the same brightness or darkness as the background, so it's very hard to see what you're doing. And this same theory would apply if you had something where there was just a lot of stuff going on, or you were having a hard time seeing the edges. And one of the first things I remind people is that most of the tools in Photoshop, when they're making selections, are looking for edges. So if you can't see an edge, neither can Photoshop. So in a case like this, what I would do is, here's my background image, and I'm just going to open that one. And I'm going to take my soccer player, and because again I have this smart object concept turned on, that means that I'm working non-destructively, because any setting I do in Camera Raw can be adjusted. So I'm going to temporarily change the exposure dramatically on my photo, so now I can see the edge where his hair is. It makes the rest of the photograph look horrible, but that's okay, because my only goal at this point is trying to make Photoshop's job easier of making the selection. It's not going to stay that way, but that's kind of the point, is I'm doing this with that same theory of ending up with things looking the same way. or the way that I want. So I'm going to drag him over into this other document. And this is also a very important tip we talk about in the 30-day class, is that when you're trying to do any kind of compositing, the first thing you should do is drag the person or the subject onto the new background, and then every decision you're making is in the context of the new background. So in this case, once again, I would take the quick selection tool and just kind of quickly go around and try and get. I'm going to do this fairly quickly. Normally I would spend a bit more time on this part just trying to make sure, but just so you get the idea. Try and get it. This is one of those tools that's great because I don't have to hold down any keys. It just keeps adding to my selection. And I want to get fairly close to the edge of his hair. Like this. And then I go to Refine Edge. Now, in Refine Edge, here's an important notice or thing to take note of. Now that I'm in here, right away I can see I missed part of his ear completely. The best thing for me to do is hit Cancel and go back and fix it, because if I try to fix that in Refine Edge, it's not going to work. Refine Edge does exactly what the name suggests. It makes the edge a little better. It won't help if there's big missing pieces. So now that I've got that, I hit Refine Edge. I'm in this view called On Layers, which is how we get the new background to kind of show through. Okay. Now, at this point, it actually, to me, looks pretty decent. Let's zoom in a little closer. I'm not going to worry right now about the shoelaces. I can get those manually later on. But overall, it looks pretty good. I might try and get a few more little hairs up here just painting around. This would be next to impossible to do. I couldn't even made that first selection if he was as dark as the original photograph. So at this point, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to click Add Layer Mask, and except for the fact that he looks way too bright, the edge looks pretty good. Well, this is the advantage right here of using the camera raw smart object, so I can go back and forth, and using that philosophy of I want to end up with this particular look, is now that I know I've made Photoshop's job easier to make the mask, now I can double click on the smart object and go back and say, let's put it back the way it was shot, because that's really what I had in mind. Maybe just a hair brighter, but I want that kind of dramatic lighting look going on. Click OK. It will now update, and now you see right away it looks a lot more realistic because of the lighting matches the background. And just as an aside, the background is also a camera raw smart object, so if I wanted to, I could go in and continue to tweak that one as well. And the only thing that I would probably do, now that I look at it in context, is go back here and change the color temperature just a little bit to try and match the color of the background, just so it looks a little more realistic. I could also use adjustment layers, but that concept of making a temporary change of some kind, whether it's camera raw or an adjustment layer or something, is to me a procedure I do almost every day, because it's easier. So instead of struggling trying to determine why can't that tool that I'm using do its job in Photoshop, it's because you're not giving it an opportunity to do its job because of what you're presenting it with. So if you temporarily change things, then it gives you more opportunity to say, well, let's see what happens if I try this. I can push colors in a certain direction and put them back, or as we did in this case, change the exposure dramatically, all with the goal of making things easier, and then once I'm done that, put it back the way that I want.
Okay, even I learned something. Yeah, so it looks like I think we can wrap up here. You do have a class, as you've mentioned, and as I've mentioned, coming up in June. Do you want to talk a little bit about that now?
Definitely. It's always a fun challenge to decide when let's do another class. I'm like, sure, what do I do it on? And one of the things that the 30-day class really taught me was there's a lot of material to cover that you can split into segments, but at the same time there are certain things that we use all the time. So part of the concept of this class is actually called Everyday Photoshop, from Workflow to Smartflow. And the idea of it is kind of twofold. One of them is, first of all, these are techniques you can use every day. It's not every day in terms of, oh, who cares, it's, you know, standard or normal. This means things you can use every day, because I watch certain tutorials on various websites and they're like, how to make an exploding planet. And I'm like, great if I ever want to make a planet explode. But I can't imagine using that in my everyday work that I'm doing in Photoshop. So that's part one of it, is these are techniques that you can use all the time. They're not recipes that say follow these 25 steps. It's here's why all these things are important. It kind of revolves around working non-destructively, as we've been talking about in this Hangout so far, is all these things like layers and smart filters and adjustment layers give us lots of good opportunities that we wouldn't have if we use alternate methods. And I watch a lot of people work, and a lot of people ask me about workflow and what's your workflow, and this is my workflow. And I once joked about this to say the only thing I don't like about workflow, it has the word work in it, as in why am I working so hard? So that's why I only, not that it's going to probably ever catch on, but I use the term Smartflow to suggest here are things that you can do that just are working smarter, so that you can do the following. You can work more accurately, you can work more quickly, you can be more creative because you know you've got lots of opportunity to change your mind, and you can also repurpose. One of the things that I talk about in the little promo video we put together is, I'm guessing that this has happened to a lot of people over the years, because they tell me this has, where they're playing around in Photoshop, experimenting and trying various things, and they come up with some effect they really like, and they save it as a JPEG. And then they come back 6 months later and look at it and go, how on earth did I do that? Because there's nothing there to tell you how you achieved that. Instead, if you structured it as a Photoshop document with all this information, you could reverse engineer it and see how you did it. You could tweak those results, and you could even repurpose and say, I'm going to take that same grungy overlay effect I did on this photo and drag it into that other photo. And so those are the things we're going to talk about in this class. It's June 9th through 11th. Everyday Photoshop, from workflow to Smartflow.
Okay, great, thanks. If you want to learn more about the class, you can go to the Creative Live website, and you can search for Dave by name, and it'll pull it up, saying that it is coming. And, okay, we're going to wrap it up, but I've got actually a really great...
Can I mention one other thing, sorry. So I don't forget? I just thought of this now.
Okay.
I know that when you're watching a class, my hope is to give you lots of information, and sometimes it's hard and you feel like you need to scramble to write all kinds of notes. As part of the deal, if you end up purchasing the class, if you like it enough that you want to purchase it, I put together I think I want to say it's a 38-page PDF file of notes, so that just about everything I talk about, unless there's something that comes up on the fly, the main topics are included for those people that purchase the class. There's this PDF that comes along with it.
Wow, that's great. I'm actually on the page, and it's there right now. Some classes, the bonuses don't show up right away. So if you enroll and you're there when the class goes live, you'll be able to get that. But to wrap up, someone left a really nice comment. Let's see. It is, I'm going to select it. It's not a question, but it's in the question section. And he says, I'm afraid I have to go early. Thanks, Dave, for your insights, and thanks, Betty, for sharing your work. Nelson Wong. So, a nice way to sign off. So, that is all. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and those who are watching after the fact. And we are done.